and those recordings will be uploaded to YouTube as some of my other online presentations have. So if you happen to miss it, just know that you'll still have access to it at some point in the near future. So before we go any further, let me just further introduce myself for those of you that do not know. As I mentioned, I'm the University Ombuds here at Northeastern, and my office provides confidential, informal, impartial, and independent services to members of the university community, whether you're staff, faculty, or a student, to work through and address challenging and difficult situations such as conflict. And so my contact information will be at the end of the slides for people who want to reach out to me directly. I won't say a whole lot more about my office right now because we do have limited time, and that's not the full reason why we're here. But just know that I am here as a resource to help people work through and manage difficult situations. Many of them we'll talk about today. So at any point, even during these remote times, you can reach out to me by phone or by email. We can set up a time to speak by phone or video chat to talk about a situation that you might be facing and what some options might be for addressing it or resolving it. But for today, we'll spend our time talking about group leadership and collaboration. I know that there are plenty of people who have experience with group leadership and collaboration from the question that I answered in the pre-session questionnaire, and there are plenty of people who don't have that yet, but certainly are interested in leading some sort of group or facilitating some sort of team collaboration in the future. So we have a mix of different experience levels here, and so I'm going to present the information in as an accessible way as I can. However, there are a couple things to note before we get started. The first thing is, if you have experience with group leadership or collaboration, it doesn't really matter. Your experiences and opinions are not relevant. And if you have not had any experience, please do not comment on any of the materials presented. Secondly, I cannot tell you how this presentation is going to go, what exactly it will cover, or whether or not it will even be helpful for you. And please do not ask any questions along the way. You'll need my permission also before you put any of these concepts or strategies that I talk about today into practice in your own work or life. I'm not here to help you beyond what I present in these sessions today. Plus, if you're not an Ombuds like me, you probably won't understand what I'm about to share anyway. And at the end of this session, there will be a quiz via email that will impact your ability to participate in part 2. The majority of you will probably not pass this quiz. However, if you are a student listening in, you do not have to take that quiz. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, just waiting to see how many people have dropped off. Okay, so obviously, this is not true. None of this. And hopefully, as I was reading it with a level of seriousness, you were reacting to it in the way that I would expect any human to react to it, which is with confusion or offense or a feeling of disrespect or whatever, anger, frustration, you name it. And there's good reason for that. And there is good reason in every one of the things that I said for you to be reacting in that kind of a way. And that's going to be the basis of what we continue to talk about today when we think about group leadership and group collaboration. So remember these things that I just said about a few minutes ago and how you reacted to them when I said them. And we'll circle back at the end of this session today after we've covered the bulk of the materials, and we'll talk about why you had those reactions and what they actually mean. So don't worry, none of the things that I said, just to reiterate, are true. If you do have experience, I welcome you to share that. If you don't have experience with this topic, I welcome you to still share your thoughts, your ideas, your opinions. There will not be a quiz at the end of this. You do not need my permission to put these things into action in your own life and in your work. And you certainly can understand these concepts regardless of whether or not you are actually an Ombuds. And I will tell you exactly what we're going to talk about today, how we'll talk about it, and how it might be helpful to you. So it doesn't look like we lost too many people after that. All right, so let's get to that. Let's get to talking about what we will cover today. Now, this is a working agenda because I must be flexible with time depending on how things unfold, the kinds of questions or comments that might come up, how much time that we have to and attention that we have to put into them, and where that leaves us. But in general, the way that I'm expecting to use the time is 15 minutes, about 15 minutes to introduce a particular brain-based model called the SCARF model. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may have not. Either way, that's okay. We'll spend about 5 questions, 5 minutes specifically, to just talk about questions and discussion. So I will pause. This is some feedback I got in some of the other sessions, and open it up for questions through the chat feature for those of you who are online, and questions through the audio for those of you who are listening by phone. So we'll take a few minutes to address some questions. We may or may not get to all of them. The ones that we don't get to, we'll table and make sure that we circle back to in some way, shape, or form beyond today, and maybe even in the next session. We'll spend then the bulk of the time, about 25 minutes, talking about how we can actually put the model that I'm going to introduce into action as leaders. And then we'll end with another period, about 10 minutes or so, of additional questions and discussion. And I'll go ahead and preview what it is that we will continue to cover in part 2 next Tuesday. So hopefully this gives you a general sense of how we're going to go about using our time today. We're, of course, already 10 minutes in, and so we'll have to be flexible in many ways, but that's certainly okay and to be expected.
No.
Okay. So as I mentioned, we're going to start by an introduction to what's called the SCARF model, and SCARF is an acronym, and we'll talk about what that stands for. But first, just in general, it's as I mentioned, a brain-based model developed by a gentleman named David Rock, who is the director of the Neuro Leadership Institute. He developed this and published it for the first time back in 2008. And it's a model to explain how our social triggers influence us to behave in certain ways. Now, that sounds pretty broad and ambiguous, and that's okay, because we're going to take a deeper dive into what exactly that means. And we'll start first by talking about the neuroscience research that this model is grounded and based in. So the neuroscience research tells us that our brains react in the same way to social needs as they do to primary needs like food and water. The neuroscience research also tells us that our brains will cause us to behave in ways that try to minimize what we perceive to be as threats and maximize what we perceive to be as rewards. So in other words, if we experience some sort of stimulus, like an event or an incident that we associate with some sort of positive emotion or reward, we're most likely going to approach that and work towards that in some way. And if we experience some sort of stimulus that is associated, or at least we associate with negative emotions or punishments or unfavorable consequences, we will most likely perceive that as a threat and probably try to avoid it. It's actually interesting that the research does show that the area of our brain is active, the same area of our brain is activated for social threats and rewards in the same way that it is for things like physical pain. So if you experience physical pain, the same area of the brain is activated as if you perceive some sort of social threat. And again, that's really the basis for the model that we're going to continue to describe. But if this seems a little bit convoluted, a little bit complex right now, that's okay. We'll break it down further as we go forward. So then if our brain operates in a way that tries to maximize and work towards things that we see as rewards and minimize and work away from things that we perceive to be threats, then it's important to understand what are the kinds of things, what are the kinds of factors, social factors in particular, that are going to activate those threat or rewards responses in our brain and then subsequently impact our behavior. So the neuroscience research also tells us what those things are, and this is where the acronym comes from. So the first thing is status. So our sense of importance in relation to others is where status comes from. So we're going to, in everyday interactions, especially in social interactions, we're going to constantly be making determinations consciously and subconsciously about whether or not something is some sort of threat or reward to our status. Again, the way that we see our importance in relation to others. It's also another domain, social domain, so to speak, that triggers that response of threat and reward is certainty. So our ability to have clarity and make accurate predictions about the future. The third one is around autonomy. So that's our sense of control of different events, our environment, and how perceptions, how we have formulate perceptions of our influence over certain outcomes in situations. The fourth one is our sense of relatedness. So that's how we feel about our ability to fit in and connect with others, and our sense of safety and security with others in social situations. And the last one is around fairness. So how fairly do we perceive exchanges that we have with others, or decisions that are made that involve us? So these 5 areas, status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, are areas that on a regular basis in social situations are likely to be triggers for threat and reward responses. So if we have that understanding, well then what does that mean even further? Like, what actually happens when we feel threatened or rewarded? And I think this is what really gets to the heart of the model and helps us to understand why this may be relevant when we think about ourselves as being leaders of groups and trying to facilitate collaboration. So I think this diagram that some of you can see on the screen, but I'll talk through for others, really explains it in a way that is understandable and relatable, and I hope, but I'm certainly welcoming your feedback. So we have these 5 areas: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And in individual incidents and circumstances, we can either perceive a threat or some sort of reward. If we perceive a threat in any of these areas, a threat to our status, a threat to our level of certainty, our threat to our autonomy, our sense of relatedness, our sense of fairness, then it's going to release cortisol in our system biologically, which is going to produce stress. It's going to cause us to feel disengaged in ways, or distracted, or thinking less clearly, or feeling anxious about a situation. It's going to cause us to focus on the problem as opposed to what a solution could be. It's going to cause us to actually, it's going to impact our ability to actually recall certain things and have the kind of reliable memory that we would like to have. And it's also going to just overall impact and reduce our performance. Now, on the other side of things, if we experience something around our status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, or fairness that we perceive to be a reward, a positive thing, then it's going to release serotonin. And so it's the opposite of that cortisol that produces stress. It's going to make us feel more happy. It's going to make us feel more positive, more engaged, more focused, more willing to collaborate. Instead of being problem focused, we're going to be solution focused. We're going to be we're going to be able to tap into a place of innovation and creativity. We're going to want to be more involved in something and engaged. We're going to also find ways to be more resilient and flexible and able to deal with adversity and challenging situations and tough problems and complex issues. And so you can see how this could significantly impact the way in which people that we're leading function, operate, perform, connect with one another, collaborate with one another, communicate with one another, problem solve with one another. If we're constantly doing things as leaders or even as members of a team that are going to be perceived as threats to these 5 social domains, then that's going to take us in the wrong direction. If we're doing things that people are going to perceive to be positive and rewards in those 5 social domains, it is going to heighten the performance. It's going to increase the likeliness that the group functions in the way that we would hope for and expect. So I'm going to pause for just a second and check the chat feature. I know that there's a lot going on. I want to just make sure that there's nothing significant that I'm missing in terms of, okay. Looks like we're doing all right. People can see the slides. It's helpful. Okay. So just to recap, this is a model based in the neuroscience. It looks at how our brain operates in social situations and how we behave based off of perceived threats and rewards, and then the actual impact that that has on our behavior, Again, you can just think about it as being disengaged or engaged or distracted or focused. And we'll continue to talk about as we move forward how we as leaders can use this understanding and use this model to connect with people in ways that move us towards that more reward and positive end in the experience that people have. We're going to talk generally today about the kinds of things that we can be paying attention to in each one of these 5 social domains to increase the likeliness that there are perceived rewards. And then as we move forward with the second session, we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into that and have some more pointed examples. But that brings us to this question of, so how can we as leaders specifically utilize this SCARF model? What can it do for us? What can it help us achieve? Well, the first thing I think is just simply an understanding of the model can help us more effectively engage the group, as I mentioned before, and as a whole, and also just in individual team members. And of course, when people feel more engaged, their performance is going to change. They're going to be more effective in what they do. They're going to be more willing to contribute in certain ways. They're going to, all the things that we saw on the other slide, be more creative, more innovative, and more invested in the situation, whatever it might be. We also can use this model to kind of empower people to meet their full potential, which, I mean, it's kind of hard to argue that that isn't a good thing or a helpful thing for leaders. How can we take advantage of the individual strengths and talents that people have and maximize that in a way that allows them to reach their full potential, makes them feel good about the contributions that they're making and their sense of involvement in the team, but also, of course, benefits us as a leader of that team or benefits the team as a whole. We can also, as leaders, think about how this model supports the idea in general of collaboration, people working together, sharing information, sharing resources, working on problem solving together, having a sense of interdependence that works well and doesn't set up unhealthy competition, all of the kinds of things that you would hope for in some sort of collaborative, functioning, collaborative team. And I want to just be clear, as we move forward, we can think about work teams, we can think about academic teams, we can think about professional teams, we could think about task force, we can think about other working groups, we could think about even a sports team, any kind of team, any kind of group that's working together that either has some sense of shared leadership or an individual or a team of people who are guiding it and leading it. And as we move forward and as we talk about some of the examples and get into the second session, we'll look at its applicability, so to speak, on a variety of different teams. Sounds like a cat or something is not happy with what I just mentioned. Let's go ahead and jump back into how this can benefit us as leaders. So we talked about just overall engaging people, empowering people, supporting collaboration and problem solving, but it also can create an environment of trust. It can also create an environment of shared accountability, and it can also help us move through change productively. That's actually one of the ways in which this model, I think, can be most useful, at least in my own opinion and some of my own experiences, is thinking about how we move forward and manage change situations. And we can think about change in a number of different ways. And as I was putting this presentation together and thinking about this model and remembering some of the things that I really appreciate about it, I could not help but to think about how it matters so much today, right now, in the midst of what we're going through right now as a university and shifting to remote operations, and how we create some sense of stability and positive elements of that change moving forward. So I encourage you to also think about, as we continue to unpack this model and think about it, how it might apply to you in the individual situation that you're facing right now, even in the midst of the change due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And a few other things that I think are important to note in terms of its utility for leaders. I think this model and understanding the model and the 5 different social domains that it focuses on, again, status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, understanding them and the impact of them will allow us to think about ways in which people might be motivated to behave in certain ways. If you're feeling frustrated by an experience that you're having with someone, maybe it's a pattern or something that keeps happening or keeps coming up. I mean, you're not quite sure how to make sense of that, how to address it. You can use this model to think about, where some of that behavior might be coming from. Maybe the person does feel like it is a threat to whatever's happening, is becoming a threat to their status in some way and their relative importance to others and how they perceive that. Or maybe they feel like it's a threat to their autonomy. They feel like they're being micromanaged or not trusted or controlled too much. Or maybe they just overall feel a sense of lack of fairness in the way in which decisions are being made and how information is being communicated around that. So it can help us to kind of narrow down the different factors that might be influencing the behaviors that we're experiencing from others and also ourselves. I use this model all the time to kind of reflect on my own behavior and the way in which I show up in situations and how I react to certain kind of social interactions, incidents with people, whether it's positive or negative. I use this model to think about where is that maybe coming from? What can I learn about myself as it relates to this model? And then we can also, so not just in a reflective way and thinking about where the behavior might be coming from, but we can also then look at what are some targeted ways that we can address the problem. If we have a sense of where it's coming from, maybe someone does feel like something continues to be a threat to their autonomy, then we can think about specific things that we can do that increase the likeliness that they have that rewards experience around things related to autonomy. And we can start to figure out ways to intervene on the problem or the issue or the conflict accordingly. And sometimes it's all 5 of these areas, and we have to really be comprehensive and think about how we take a more holistic approach. And other times, maybe it's just one particular area or a handful of areas. I know I'm moving a little bit quickly here because we had a bit of a delayed start and we also had some technical things to work through. So I do want to pause right now for some questions and discussion. But just before we do that, again, I'll recap. We kind of briefly introduced the model and talked about some of the neuroscience research that it's grounded in. We talked about those 5 different social domains, which are the kind of factors that trigger or activate those rewards and threat responses. We talked about the impact that it has on us and our behaviors when we feel that sense of threat socially or reward socially. We talked about how as leaders, we can use this model and our understanding of these different social domains and how they trigger these responses in order to engage with people, engage with our teams, and reflect even ourselves on our own behavior in a way that helps us to function better and be more collaborative and be more effective in whatever it is that we might be doing as a team or a group. So pausing there, I just want to check in to see if folks have questions or comments that they want to make. I'm going to go ahead and Nancy, thank you. She says cats hate collaboration. I think that's true. So I'm going to pause and in the chat, I'm going to monitor anything that comes through there for those that are online. And if you are online, I would just encourage you, I hate to do this, but because we have 65 people, it might get a little challenging to facilitate and to manage. So if you are online, I just ask you to stick to the chat feature. If you're only joining in by phone, just go ahead and unmute yourself and use the audio to ask any kind of questions or make comments or throw out a point of discussion right now before we jump back into the materials. So Alicia asks, is there a worksheet or questionnaire that can be used to work with teams to assess collaboration within the team? There are some resources like that out there, and I will make sure that they are made available to folks at the conclusion of the, most likely the second session. At the end of the slides that I'm going to present today too, there are the references to things that I mentioned in the slide, but also just additional resources and some links to some different articles that might be helpful. But there are some resources out there like that that I'd be happy to share with folks. So another question or comment comes in, says maybe getting ahead of myself, but we hope we talked about how to address unideal performance by a staff member. So we're going to talk about performance in a way and feedback in a way, especially as it relates to the status section and also the autonomy section. It really does kind of run through all of them. We might dig a bit deeper into that in session 2. And if we don't cover it in the way that you specifically are hoping for, or there's other things that you're hoping to get out of that kind of a discussion, then I'd be happy to follow up with people one-on-one or in other ways to be able to dig a bit deeper into some of the techniques that can be used in a situation like that. Will we discuss techniques to engage students remotely in terms of collaboration? I think we will touch on some of that, and we will keep in mind what it means to apply these kinds of things in a remote operating kind of world that we're in right now. And we may dig a bit deeper into that into session 2 as well. Again, I'll say the same thing. If we don't address a topic like that in a way that gives you the kind of ideas that you're looking for around how to address that, please feel free to follow up with me one-on-one, and we can talk about some more specific strategies given the uniqueness of the situation. Okay. So, best practices for feedback, collaboration in virtual meetings and virtual work. Yes, that's definitely a big one right now. I have some, so we will talk a little bit about feedback. Of course, we're going to continue the theme of talking about collaboration. We're going to take into consideration how some of this applies to the virtual and remote world. And so, yes, we will get into some of that to a degree. We may, again, I feel like a broken record here, but this is still true, dig a bit deeper into that, and some of the examples we'll go through in session 2. And if you have particular situations that you're facing that continue to be a challenge, and the kinds of things that we bring up and discuss today and next Tuesday don't necessarily address it in the way that you hope, we can always chat further. Okay, there's another comment about the importance of growing your team. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can look at that. Here's the challenge of electronic communication, is that it's up to interpretation many times. And so I can interpret that in a couple of ways: growing in terms of just numbers, and do you have enough people in order to get the work done that you're hoping to and meet the expectations that you have, and not have people feel exhausted or overworked, but also growing in terms of like personal development and growth for people professionally and in other ways. So yes, we are going to talk about the importance of that. Okay, so as I mentioned, we want to talk now about kind of putting this model into action, and what are the kinds of things that we can do specifically to reduce threat responses and increase reward responses. I know I keep using the word specifically. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. These are kind of specific considerations, strategies, but not the kind of specificity to, think about exactly how that is applied to every, kind of situation that we might face, of course. So there is some general nature to this as well, just for the sake of time and wanting to kind of cover as much of the 5 social domains as we can. But in the next session, we will dig into the specifics a bit more. Okay, so the first one, as you recall, is status. So what are the kinds of things that we can do around status? Some of this has come up. So one of the biggest things that we can do is give feedback, but give feedback in a particular way. Of course, positive feedback, letting people know that they're meeting expectations and that you appreciate that and you want that to continue, is a huge thing. And it does trigger that reward response and keeps people kind of engaged and doing what they're doing, that's working out well and is successful, and that you both might be mutually benefiting from, or the team might be benefiting from. But there's also, when people aren't meeting expectations, I know a comment came up about this, or the unideal performance. We can approach feedback in a coaching way, which comes from a place of support. It is clear that you may not be meeting expectations, However, the goal is to kind of get you there and figure out what might be getting in the way of that, and how I and how you yourself can kind of support getting to that place where you're meeting expectations. So feedback in those ways, both positive and kind of supportive coaching, not just criticism, not just telling somebody that they're wrong, they're not doing it right, they're still, not performing well, all those kinds of things, is going to reduce that increase that rewards response. Now, there are whole sessions, and I'm even thinking about rolling one out in the near future here, just about feedback in terms of giving it and also receiving it. So we're not going to take the kind of deep dive that I would in one of those sessions, but that might be available. And there's plenty of kind of literature and resources out there. Please feel free to follow up with me if you're just interested in more effective ways of giving feedback. When we give that positive feedback, when we give that coaching supportive feedback, it does increase that rewards response. You can imagine what increases the threats response is when people feel just criticized, when people feel embarrassed, when people feel put down, when people feel dismissed, when people feel repeatedly told that they're not enough, they're not meeting expectations. That's going to cause them to disengage even further. One thing that we can also do is allow people to do self-evaluation. Allow them to think themselves about how they're performing, how they're doing, how they're showing up as a member of the team, what they're doing well, where some of their challenges are, what they might do in order to address them. Anyway, that kind of self-evaluation, that self-reflection before you as a leader or even as a team member jump into giving your feedback can be a really positive thing, can trigger that reward response. And just general acknowledgement for people and recognition of their accomplishments and progress that they're making and their contributions to the team goes a long way for increasing that rewards response too. Increasing a sense or creating a sense of inclusion and access for people in teams is important. Asking people for their ideas, their opinion, their help, especially as a leader, not just assuming that you have the answers, that you know the way to fix all of the problems, that you know the best direction to go in, that you know the way to go about this initiative or this project. Really reaching out, taking advantage of your team, letting them know that their opinions, their ideas, their help matters. Those are the kinds of things that increase that rewards response. And additionally, we can draw on the areas of expertise that people already have. I mentioned this a bit earlier, but like thinking about what strengths people already have, what they do well, what they excel in, and how do we take advantage of that? How do we tap into that, draw on that, look to them for that? That increases people's desire to be engaged, their focus, their creativity, their innovation. We can always simply listen to people, really be present, listen to understand, listen in a way that shows that we care, that they matter. Those simple things go a long way for increasing that rewards response. Reassuring people of their value in teams and in groups. Just letting them know that their contributions, their presence, their role, their actions, their decisions, their work, whatever it might be, matters and is valued and is important in the functioning of the team. No matter what their role is or how you perceive that on kind of the hierarchy of positions, everyone matters in some way. Everyone contributes in some way. I think we're seeing that so much as a society right now where a lot of positions that maybe were overlooked before, we're now relying on as essential workers. And it's so important to reassure those people of the value that they bring to us right now and the importance of them right now. And I think in our own kind of smaller institutions and communities, that's going on as well. Providing learning opportunities for people. This came up before in the chat about growing the team. This is huge. This is a great way to increase reward responses. Letting people or working with people, collaborating with people to figure out what are some opportunities for their own growth, for their own development, for their own learning. How can you support them in doing that? How can you help them think through what that might be? How they can continue to build on their areas of strength, where they find themselves coming short or challenged in certain ways based off that self-evaluation that they did. What are some opportunities that can help them to address those kinds of things? And of course, we often think in this area of like just offering promotions that obviously increases someone's kind of sense of status and their relative importance to others, or compensation or certain rewards. And that's not just in the workplace, that could be in other teams too. I mean, just getting You think about a sports team or some other team, like just getting promoted to a different kind of position in a way, new responsibilities, new sense of kind of leadership in a way. Those kinds of things activate the rewards responses. I want to be clear too, before we go any further, that I'm not saying that every single one of these things is going to apply to the group or the team that you're leading or facilitating or hoping to in the future. But these are in general the kinds of things that do increase that rewards response and reduce that threats response. And there are ways in which we can explore many of them. Moving on to certainty. This one is somewhat straightforward in a way, but maybe a little bit more nuanced than you think. We all feel like we benefit when we have a sense of awareness of what to expect in the future, and what our role in that might be and how that's going to impact us. You can think about right now what is so difficult and what's going on in the world right now for many of us is there's this just looming degree of uncertainty about what to expect moving forward. And you know how difficult that can be. And so anything that we can do as leaders to increase the sense of certainty that people have goes a long way towards increasing that rewards response. It sometimes starts very clearly with just setting expectations, goals, outcomes, objectives, especially if you're working in some sort of group that's working towards producing something or some sort of outcome, or you have a particular function that there are certain goals or objectives or hoped for outcomes that come from that. Being realistic about what schedules should be and what timelines and deadlines should be, and being explicit and realistic. Communicating often with people and in an open way and in an effective way in terms of styles and modes. We think about today in remote operations, the over communicating can in some ways be helpful, right? Just to keep people informed, keep them engaged, keep them aware, figuring out multiple ways to do that, whether it's by email or whether it's by phone or whether it's by some sort of other collaborative platform in the Google apps or something else, or whether it's by video. But that sense of communication, that sense of sharing information, of course, goes a long way for increasing that feeling of certainty. And when you are communicating, it can be really helpful to focus on what is certain, what you do know, and communicating that explicitly. But it's also important to think about being explicit about what you don't know and what you are uncertain about. Instead of just not saying anything at all and saying, well, we'll wait till we have more information before we talk about that. I'm not saying it's appropriate in every situation, but a lot of times it can go a long way if you just say, you know what, we're not quite sure how this is going to play out, how this is going to go, or when this might end, or when this might come up. But we are committed, I am committed to keeping you informed about that, letting you know when new information comes, and giving you a sense of when we might have some clarity around that. Just being clear about what you're uncertain about too can go a long way for people. And again, there's more. You can encourage planning and just being clear and specific about what you're trying to do, how you're trying to do it, by when you're trying to do it. You can think about this in so many ways, a project management standpoint, a strategic planning standpoint, but that sense of where are we and where are we going and how are we going to get there is great for just creating that sense of certainty. And if there are big projects or big initiatives, there can be value in breaking them down into smaller steps or smaller tasks for people that feels a bit more manageable, easier to digest, easier to comprehend and understand, and have some feeling of control and certainty over. When things aren't clear and are explicit, finding ways to make them implicit in certain ways, thinking about what really needs to be said, what really needs to be described, how much needs to be described, when things feel confusing or unclear, how can we find ways to be able to provide that clarity? As I said before, when we are uncertain about things, just being transparent about that. We can also we can work ourselves and we can encourage others to develop a sense of resilience and a sense of flexibility in working with and through periods of uncertainty. There is a real skill in that, and everybody's kind of at a different level in terms of their comfort with that and their abilities around that, but there are resources around building resilience and what it means to kind of be adaptive and flexible that can go a long way for helping people cope with times of uncertainty and figuring out what they do have control over, and how they can work with that, and accepting in ways the uncertainty and what that means for them. So that brings us to autonomy. The way that we hear this come up a lot, as I mentioned earlier, is like, I feel like I'm being micromanaged. I feel like there's a sense of control that's needed, and I have no freedom in doing things the way that I want to do or the way that I think is helpful. We also see the challenges around trust come up in this area all the time. I don't feel trusted to do a good job, to follow through, or I feel a sense of distrust with someone else. It's hard for me to trust that they're going to be able to do a good job with this, or it feels hard for me to trust their intentions, or it feels hard for me to trust them to follow through with what they say they are going to do. Again, this is just an area where we see trust and that sense of kind of micromanagement come up. So it can be helpful to delegate things to others, especially in a leadership role, especially if it's not kind of a flat leadership kind of group and you do find yourself in that role where you really are truly the sole leader in a sense, at least formally, officially. But delegating also in a way that's clear. People are aware of what's expected of them and how to go about achieving that. Allowing people to have choice and to have options is huge. In this, instead of just imposing things, really giving people something to choose from when there is flexibility. And I get, not every situation is going to allow for that, but there may be more situations than we think where people can have a sense of choice, or at least have some options to pick from. Giving people some autonomy and flexibility in how they self-organize and go about their work, manage their time. In times of remote operations like this, we often hear people talk about like managing and focusing on outcomes, not necessarily kind of how we get there, right? So just looking at what are people producing, what are the outcomes, what are the kind of deliverables, not necessarily focusing on just strict management of their time and dictating how they use their time. Again, I'm not saying that's appropriate for everyone, but those are the kinds of things that we can think about. How do we provide people flexibility in how they go about what they're getting done, what they need that works best for them, while also holding them accountable to whatever the outcome that's expected is. We can be inclusive and involve people in the decision-making processes. That's huge. We talked about earlier in terms of status, like asking for ideas, asking for opinions, asking for help. Well, on this side too, with autonomy, this is huge because, as we talked about in the very beginning, autonomy is also about a sense of control or influence that people have in outcomes. And so the more that we can involve people in the decision-making process and be inclusive about that, the more that kind of increases that sense of reward response and that positive engagement. We can also increase responsibilities for people. And I don't just mean like adding more to their plate for the sake of it, but I do mean kind of giving people more responsibilities, kind of increasing that as you see fit. When somebody's doing something well, kind of acknowledging that, and also maybe giving them a heightened responsibility in whatever that area is. So that not only gets to the status piece, but it gets to the autonomy piece as well. And we can encourage self-learning. We talked about this on the side when we were talking about feedback and kind of growth opportunities, but also just self-learning. So what does that mean? Kind of it's empowering people to be able to figure things out themselves as well, not just always having the answer for them. It kind of gets to the old analogy around teaching someone to fish as opposed to catching the fish for them, right? It's like, how can they learn themselves how to do something, and being clear about what people need in order to learn. Everyone's different in that way, as we know, and kind of honoring those different needs that people might have in that process. Encouraging or empowering people to do their own problem solving, again, as opposed to just coming to you and seeing you as the fixer. This is where kind of coaching and mentoring can really be valuable, and helping them find their way themselves and figuring out how they resolve the situation, what they need to do, as opposed to just relying on someone else. These are things that you can do. And I think there's a fine line here, right? there is a difference between saying, like, let's talk through this. Let's think about how you might be able to address this. Let's think about how I might be able to support you in doing that. But I really think it's important for you to be able to, figure out what the solution to this problem might be and what you might need to do to get there and what you can learn in that process. That's very different from just saying to someone, like, you need to figure this out before you bring it to me. Obviously, that's going to trigger the threat response in other ways. Maybe relatedness, it may be fairness, it may be status, all sorts of things. So we have to be careful too about how we're interpreting some of these things. And I think that's why in session 2, when we apply it more specifically, some of those nuances might come about. We can also just ask questions of people rather than just giving them instructions. I kind of demonstrated that in my last example. So asking people open-ended questions. What do you think that you need? What would help you? What have you already thought about? What do you feel like is holding you back? What's creating a barrier here? What's challenging? What's getting in the way? How might we go about addressing that? Those kinds of questions, as opposed to just saying, this is what you need to do. Also, I say all this like really wanting to encourage people's kind of independence and autonomy and sense of control and influence on outcomes and themselves. But also it's important as a leader to recognize when people need help and when they do need direction and when you can step in. And a lot of times, if you're paying attention to the other things that we're talking about and you're increasing reward responses and reducing threat responses in some of these other social domains, people are going to be more likely to ask you and be vulnerable for help and say, I really have tried. I've exhausted my options. I'm not quite sure to do about this. Given your role, given your experience, given whatever it might be, I think that you might have a perspective on this that could be really helpful. You might be able to give me some guidance or some direction or figure out what's needed in order to address this situation. And that's okay, right? It's not that we have to, at that point, just continue to press and force autonomy and independence in their own thinking. It's okay for people to be able to ask for help when it's truly needed. And it's important to be mindful of when that is and how you step in as a leader. Okay, so I'm realizing that we're just about at time here. We only have 3 minutes left, but I do want to pause. As I mentioned before, that we might not get through everything. That, of course, has happened, and part of that's due to my long-winded nature as well. So I want to just acknowledge that on our next session, in addition to what I'm hoping to already cover by digging into some greater detail with these and looking at some specific examples of how these techniques and these strategies and these concepts are applied, we'll also finish going through the relatedness portion and the fairness portion. What I have on the slides right now are those 5 things that I listed in the very beginning of this presentation that probably caused everybody to react in a confused or frustrated or angry or worried kind of way. So everything from your experience doesn't matter to I can't tell you what's going to happen in this presentation to you need my permission to I'm not here to help you beyond this and you probably won't get it if you're not an ombuds anyway, to there will be a quiz. You can see how each of those statements, and as jarring as they may have been and surprising as they may have been, probably triggered something in each one of the domains. So the status, your experience isn't relevant, that's related to that. Certainty, I can't tell you what's going to happen here. Autonomy, you need my permission. Relatedness, you aren't going to get any support beyond today. I'm not here to be your friend. I'm not here to help you. And you probably won't get this if you're not part of the cool ombuds group anyways. And of course, fairness, there's going to be this random quiz that impacts your ability to move forward. And if you're a student, you don't have to take it. Obviously, there creates a discrepancy there. So you can see how those things that I mentioned relate to each one of these social domains that cause those reactions and those triggers in that either threat response or that reward response. And it would be really hard for me to imagine that anyone had the kind of reward response to any of those things that I said. But if you did, you can certainly follow up with me and let me know. So I want to end with that and again, create some space just here at the end, especially for those of you that are okay with hanging on for a few more minutes. For any kind of questions, any kind of discussion points, any kind of comments that you have on the aspects of the model that I've covered thus far. Again, remembering that we'll pick up where we left off next time before we go into the content that I had already planned. So questions, comments, thoughts, points of discussion? All right, everyone. Well, thank you. Thank you for attending. I appreciate your time. If you have any questions for me specifically after this session or after the next session that you want to follow up with, please feel free to reach out to me. You can contact me at ombuds@neiu.edu, or you can reach out to me at 773-442-4527.